There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Acts. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store.
Because these islanders, they know that Paul is a prisoner, but they're assuming that Paul committed some kind of great crime where he's not to go unpunished. But Paul, he just shakes off that viper into the fire and he goes on as if nothing ever happened. And so after a little while, they all change their mind about Paul. And so now he's not a murderer, but now he's a god, which isn't the first time that the pagans made Paul out to be a god. But this time they're not trying to sacrifice to him. And this gives Paul the opportunity to be entertained by Publius, who is the leading citizen, which is a technical term for a person who represented Rome on the island. And it says that Publius entertained them for 3 days, which is quite generous, because the way that this reads, it means that all 276 of them were entertained by Publius. And Paul, he laid his hand and prayed for Publius's father, who had dysentery, which what some people believe was called Malta fever, which is caused by drinking impure goat's milk. And after he was healed, all the sick were brought to Paul, and they were all healed. But the word for healed here, it's not our typical word for healed, where this word literally means to receive medical attention. And what it means by them honoring, it's most probably meaning that they gave him money, because everywhere else in the book of Acts, this Greek word used here is used for money. And you have to kind of remember that these people here, they don't have anything. They lost everything in the shipwreck, and they remain here in Malta for 3 months, which is the rest of the winter. Okay, so now it's February, and the seas are now safe to travel, and Julius, he secures passage on another Alexandrian ship. So this is the same exact kind of ship. They just crashed and shipwrecked, where it's another grain ship that's been harboring in Malta for the winter. And this Alexandrian ship has a figurehead on the bow, and all Alexandrian ships had figureheads on the bow. And this one, it's called the Twin Brothers, which everybody knew back then was Castor and Pollux, which is our constellation of what we call Gemini, who were the patron gods who were worshipped by the sailors to look after them. So these were the ones that they looked to for good luck. Okay, so now they sail 80 miles to Syracuse, which is in Sicily, and they stay there for 3 days. And then they travel 75 miles to Rhegium, which is at the bottom of Italy, so that's right at the tip of the boot. And then they sail up the peninsula 180 miles to Puteoli, which is a port at Naples, which is south of Pompeii. And they stay there for 7 days, where Paul found some Christians, and he was invited to stay with them. But we never found out who established the church in Puteoli, or for that matter, we've never figured out who established the church in Rome. But from that city, they begin their 150-mile walk to Rome. All right, so now we have this 60-year-old man who's old, because that's old in the ancient world, and he's a Jewish rabbi. And he's chained up along with all these other prisoners who are being paraded to Rome, where Paul, he's being identified with all these convicted murderers who are heading toward their death. And so they're walking on their death march, and he's having to share in all of their humiliation and shame as they walk along the Appian Way on this Roman road through all these little towns and villages. And Paul, he has no idea what the outcome of his trial will be. And then we get down to verse 15, where they're not even halfway on their walk to Rome. And then we see that there's these Christians all coming from Rome who heard Paul was coming. Were these people, they never met Paul before, and they wanted to meet him before he got to Rome. So what they did is they walked those 43 miles from Rome just to find Paul, to escort this chained, abused prisoner to Rome, where they're honoring him as if he was a returning emperor. And so they're going to walk back with him, that 43 miles back with him as he's chained. Where Paul, he didn't know they were coming, where though they've never met Paul, they loved Paul. And that's because they had already read his letter to the Romans, because they would have received that letter about 4 years earlier. And somehow they got word that Paul was coming. And they all walked for 10 more miles closer to Rome. And then it happens all over again with more Christians who have added themselves to this escort, where they're going to walk that last 33 miles back with Paul. And this has a great impact on Paul, because this was the encouragement that Paul needed at this time, where this is giving him the courage to go where he's about to go. And Paul, he gives thanks to God for this, because Paul now sees that he's not alone in his pilgrimage, where the power of their physical presence goes beyond any words. Because there's a big difference between just saying words and actually being there for someone, where your physical presence speaks much louder than any words, and it shows your love. Where you know that Julius, the centurion here, he's never seen anything ever like this happen with a prisoner. And this is why it's so important for each of us to go to church, that we're not supposed to forsake meeting with each other, because we need each other's physical presence to build each other up. You can't really do the same job from a distance. And you have to see these people that come, that none of them are identified by name here. These are just regular Christians. These are people just like us. They're not apostles. They're not leaders. They're just people willing to share his persecution and his humiliation, which is why Hebrews 10:24 and 25 says, "And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together in the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much more as we see the day approaching." Okay, so now we get to verse 16, and here we have the last of the we sections with Dr. Luke when they get to Rome. And in Rome at this time, they have a population of over 2 million people, with 1 million of these people being slaves. And then Julius, he delivers all the other prisoners to the captain of the guard. But Paul here, he's permitted to rent his own apartment, where he's under house arrest with only one guard. And because Paul's under house arrest, he can't go out and visit the other local Jewish synagogues. So Paul, he invites the Jewish leaders to his home, where Paul, he explains to them why he's in Roman custody. And he explains his innocence and how the Romans, that they didn't find fault with him and wanted to let him go. But it's all because he appealed to Caesar that they couldn't let him go. And so now Paul, he tells these local Jewish leaders from the Roman synagogue that he's not going to accuse the Jews of anything before the Roman. He doesn't want to make it any tougher on the Jews in Rome, because if you remember, the Emperor Claudius, all the Jews were commanded to leave Rome. But now here under Nero, some of the Jews are being allowed to return to Rome. So Paul, he doesn't want to bring any more trouble on these people, because he loves the Jewish people so deeply, no matter how they have treated him. And then Paul tells these leaders of the synagogue that he's called to tell them about what he's spoken in all the synagogues, about Jesus, who's the hope of Israel. And that's the reason he's in chains. And Paul, he's expecting that they all heard of him, that they've all heard about his encounter with the Jerusalem Jews. But they haven't heard a thing. The Jewish leaders from Jerusalem, even though they knew that Paul appealed to Caesar and they knew he was going to Rome, they never ever sent word to the local synagogues in Rome. And you just have to figure that they figured that they couldn't win their little case in a little local court, that they would have no chance in Rome with Caesar Nero. or else somehow they just lost interest. But you have to see here also that the Christians in Rome, they knew what was going on with Paul, where the Jews, they didn't. But the Jews here in Rome, they're open to hearing about Jesus, this new sect of Judaism that they've heard that's been spoken against everywhere. And so they're invited to come on a specific day, and Paul went through the scriptures with them, and it took him the whole day because there's so much to go through. Because there is over 300 prophecies in the Old Testament just about Jesus's first coming, not to mention his second coming. And some of them believe, but not all of them, where now they begin to argue with each other. And then Paul explains why they can't hear the truth and why they're dull of hearing. Where Paul explains to them that it was always right for him to go to the Jews first, but then he tells them that this salvation that they're rejecting, God is sending to the Gentiles, and they'll believe it. And that's exactly what happened, where the church today is mostly made up of Gentile believers. But the Jews today, they're still dull of hearing, but it's not all Jews. Some Jews, they come to Jesus. And then you have the book of Acts end here with no big spectacular ending. And we're never given the outcome of Paul's case. All we know is that he's going to be under house arrest for the next 2 years where he receives guests. And the reason it's believed that there's no big conclusion here, or it's believed by some, the whole reason that this was written, because you have to realize that the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, at one time was just one document. And they believe that this was put together by Luke to give to the Roman court to establish the facts and the background about Paul's case before his trial before Caesar. But we do know because of Paul's letter to the Philippians that Paul tells us that he expected to be released, where most Bible teachers agree that Paul was released after his first trial with Nero. We do also know things like Timothy and John Mark and Luke and Aristarchus and Epaphroditus and Justus and Demas, they all visited Paul during his imprisonment, these 2 years, where during that first imprisonment, he also met Onesimus, which was Philemon's runaway slave, where Paul led him to Christ. And this is also the place where Paul wrote the 4 prison epistles, which was Colossians, Philippians, Ephesians, and Philemon. And if he was never imprisoned, he would have just went to these places, and we wouldn't have these books in our Bible. But Acts ends, and we never hear what happens in the trial. But it's believed that when he was released, that Paul, he traveled as far as Spain. And then after this imprisonment, Paul, he wrote his 2 letters to Timothy and to Titus, where finally in 67 AD, it's believed that Paul was arrested again under different circumstances, where he didn't get to stay in a house, but he had to go to prison and he was treated as a criminal. And the last thing we hear from Paul is that he's asking Timothy to bring his cloak, where Paul was forsaken by all the believers in Rome. And it says, even including Demas, except for Luke, that Luke remained loyal to him to the end. And then the church tradition tells us that Paul, he was convicted and executed at the command of Nero in 67 or 68 AD.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.